How did this country become so rich? Trace the untold story of America's financial rise.
250 years ago, the United States was a young nation with little infrastructure, limited industry, and an uncertain future. It had farms, forests, rivers, and a growing population, but it was nowhere near the economic giant we know today. So how did that struggling new country become one of the wealthiest nations in human history? The answer isn't one invention. It isn't one president, and it certainly isn't one lucky break. America's wealth was built through a series of extraordinary transformations: land, labor, immigration, transportation, industry, technology, finance, and an enormous consumer economy. But here's the surprising part. Some of the most important decisions that shaped America's wealth happened long before the modern American economy even existed. To understand how America became rich, we have to go back to the beginning. In the late 18th century, the United States was still a fragile experiment. The Revolutionary War had ended, but independence didn't automatically create prosperity. The new nation had enormous challenges. Its roads were poor, transportation was slow, manufacturing was limited. Much of the population lived in rural communities, and the economy depended heavily on agriculture and trade. A farmer could produce more food, but getting that food to a distant market could be difficult and expensive. And that created one of America's first great economic problems. How do you turn a huge country into one connected economy? The answer would begin with something surprisingly simple: transportation. As America expanded westward, rivers became economic highways. Canals followed, and then came one of the most transformative technologies of the 19th century: the railroad. Railroads didn't simply move people. They changed the economics of the entire country. A farmer in the Midwest could now send grain to distant cities. Factories could receive raw materials from hundreds of miles away. Manufacturers could sell products to customers they had never seen. Cities could grow around transportation networks. And suddenly, America's enormous geography wasn't only a challenge. It became an economic advantage. The bigger the connected market became, the more opportunities American businesses had to grow. But transportation was only one piece of the puzzle. Another force was quietly changing America at an enormous scale: immigration. Throughout the 19th and early 20th centuries, millions of immigrants arrived in the United States. They came from different countries, spoke different languages, and brought different skills and ambitions. Many entered difficult and dangerous working conditions, but they also supplied something a rapidly industrializing economy desperately needed: labor. Factories needed workers. Railroads needed workers. Mines needed workers. Construction projects needed workers. And growing cities needed people who could build, manufacture, sell, and consume. Immigration also helped expand America's population and, with it, the size of its domestic market. And that market would eventually become one of America's greatest economic weapons. Because America wasn't simply producing more, it was learning how to produce things at a scale the world had rarely seen. That transformation accelerated during the Industrial Revolution. Factories began replacing small-scale production. Machines increased productivity. Steel became essential for railroads, bridges, buildings, and machinery. Coal powered industrial expansion, and oil would soon become one of the most valuable resources on Earth. One of the most important examples came from Pennsylvania. In 1859, Edwin Drake's successful oil well near Titusville helped demonstrate that petroleum could be extracted commercially on a significant scale. Oil would eventually transform transportation, manufacturing, lighting, and eventually the entire global economy. But America's rise wasn't just about discovering resources. It was about building systems that could turn those resources into wealth. And this is where American entrepreneurs became incredibly important. One of the most famous examples was John D. Rockefeller. Rockefeller didn't discover oil. Instead, he built a business empire around refining and distribution. His company, Standard Oil, pursued efficiency and scale aggressively. By the late 19th century, Standard Oil had become extraordinarily powerful. The lesson was becoming clear. In the new American economy, controlling an efficient system could be just as important as possessing the raw material itself. And that idea would appear again and again in American business history. But there was another revolution coming, one that would completely change how ordinary Americans bought products. And it began not with oil, but with a car. Ford's breakthrough wasn't simply inventing the automobile. Henry Ford didn't invent the car. His great achievement was helping transform automobile manufacturing into a highly standardized mass production system. The moving assembly line dramatically increased production efficiency. Cars that had once been expensive products for a relatively small market could increasingly become affordable to ordinary Americans. And this created something bigger than an automobile industry. It created an entire economic ecosystem: steel, glass, rubber, oil, road construction, auto dealerships, repair shops, gas stations, insurance, advertising. Millions of jobs and businesses became connected to the automobile, and America was beginning to discover one of its most powerful economic formulas: make a product cheaper, sell it to more people, produce even more, then make it cheaper again. This cycle would help transform America from an industrial economy into a mass consumer economy. But America's rise would soon face one of its greatest tests, because wealth can grow quickly, and it can disappear quickly too. The American economy was becoming larger, more industrial, and more connected. But in the 1920s, a dangerous weakness was growing beneath the surface. Factories were producing enormous quantities of goods. Businesses were expanding. Stock prices were rising. America looked unstoppable. Then, in October 1929, the stock market crashed. The crash was devastating. But the Great Depression that followed was even worse. Banks failed. Businesses closed. Factories cut production. Millions of Americans lost their jobs. And the economic machine that had seemed so powerful suddenly appeared broken. The lesson was painful. America had learned how to produce enormous amounts of wealth, but it still had to learn how to protect and stabilize the system that created it. The response would reshape the country. During the 1930s, President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration introduced the New Deal, a series of programs and reforms designed to respond to the economic crisis. The federal government took a much larger role in the economy. Financial regulations were strengthened. Public works projects put people to work, infrastructure expanded, and programs such as Social Security created new forms of economic security. The New Deal did not instantly end the Great Depression, and historians continue to debate how much different policies contributed to recovery. But something important had changed. Americans were beginning to see the national economy as a system that could be actively managed, not simply something that governments had to stand aside and watch. Then came another turning point, World War II. When the United States entered the war, in December 1941, American industry was mobilized on an extraordinary scale. Factories that had once produced consumer goods began producing tanks, aircraft, ships, trucks, weapons, and other military equipment. Companies that had competed for customers now became part of a massive national production effort. The scale was enormous. American shipyards produced vessels at astonishing speed. Aircraft factories expanded dramatically. Automobile manufacturers adapted their production systems for wartime needs. And millions of Americans entered the workforce, including large numbers of women. The war demonstrated something that would become central to America's economic power. America could combine enormous natural resources, industrial capacity, transportation networks, capital, technology, and labor into one coordinated production system. And when the war ended, the United States emerged in a remarkably powerful economic position. Much of Europe and Asia had suffered enormous destruction. The American mainland had not. Its factories were still standing. Its financial institutions were functioning. Its infrastructure had survived. And American companies were ready to produce for a world that needed to rebuild. But the post-war boom wasn't simply about factories. It was about consumers. After years of depression and wartime restrictions, millions of Americans wanted homes, cars, appliances, televisions, clothing, and new conveniences. Suburban development accelerated. Homeownership expanded. Highways spread across the country. Shopping centers and new forms of retail transformed daily life. And the American economy entered an era where prosperity was increasingly tied to mass consumption. This was a major shift. Earlier industrialization had focused heavily on producing steel, coal, machinery, and other industrial goods. Now, American businesses were increasingly focused on selling products to millions of individual consumers. The refrigerator, the television, the automobile, the washing machine, the suburban home. Each product represented not just a purchase, but an entire network of factories, workers, suppliers, banks, retailers, and services. The result was a powerful feedback loop. More production created more jobs. More jobs created more income. More income created more consumer demand. More demand encouraged businesses to produce more. And that production created opportunities for further investment and innovation. But there was another force accelerating America's wealth: science and technology. The United States had already developed major industrial technologies. But after World War II, the country increasingly became a center of scientific research and technological innovation. Universities, corporations, and government agencies invested heavily in research. The Cold War intensified this process. The competition with the Soviet Union pushed the United States to invest in aerospace, computing, communications, nuclear technology, and other advanced fields. The space race became a symbol of that competition. In 1969, American astronauts reached the moon, but the economic importance of technological innovation extended far beyond space exploration. Research created technologies that eventually influenced civilian industries. Computers became smaller and more powerful. Communication networks expanded. Semiconductors transformed electronics. And eventually, a new technological ecosystem began taking shape on the American West Coast, Silicon Valley. Companies and entrepreneurs there would help turn computing from a specialized technology into something that could reach hundreds of millions and eventually billions of people. The personal computer changed offices and homes. The internet changed communication and commerce. Software became one of the world's most valuable industries, and companies such as Apple, Microsoft, Intel, and later Google, Amazon, and many others demonstrated a new American formula for creating enormous economic value. Build technology that can scale. Unlike a factory that might produce thousands of physical products, software could potentially reach millions of users with comparatively little additional production cost. That changed the economics of business. But America's transformation wasn't finished, because while technology was creating new wealth, another enormous change was happening in global trade. American companies were becoming increasingly connected to the rest of the world. Supply chains stretched across continents. Products were designed in one country, manufactured in another, assembled somewhere else, and sold globally. This created new opportunities and new challenges. Some American industries became dramatically more efficient. Others faced intense competition from foreign manufacturers. Factories moved. Entire communities that had depended on industrial employment struggled to adapt. The United States was becoming less dependent on traditional manufacturing and increasingly dependent on services, finance, technology, entertainment, healthcare, and other knowledge-based industries. And once again, the American economy was changing its identity from farms to factories, from factories to mass consumer markets, and increasingly from physical production to information, technology, and intellectual property. But there was still one final transformation, a transformation that would make American companies some of the most valuable businesses in history: the rise of the digital economy. The rise of the digital economy changed the rules of American business once again. In the industrial age, economic power often depended on factories, railroads, mines, oil fields, and physical infrastructure. In the digital age, some of the world's most valuable companies could be built around something far less visible: information, a software program, a search engine, an online marketplace, a social network, a digital platform. The physical infrastructure still mattered, but the most valuable asset was increasingly the technology connecting people to it. And America was exceptionally well positioned for this transformation. It had major universities, research institutions, venture capital, financial markets, ambitious entrepreneurs, and a huge domestic consumer market. Together, these created an environment where new companies could grow extraordinarily quickly. Consider what happened with personal computing. Companies such as Microsoft helped make software a central part of everyday business. Apple helped turn computers and later smartphones into products that millions of ordinary consumers could use. Then the internet opened an even larger opportunity. Amazon began as an online bookstore in the 1990s. Its early business was relatively simple: sell books over the internet. But the underlying idea was much bigger. What if the internet could become a marketplace for almost everything? Amazon expanded into new categories, built massive logistics infrastructure, and eventually developed cloud computing services through Amazon Web Services. The company was no longer simply a retailer. It had become part of the infrastructure of the digital economy itself. Google followed a different path. Its core product was information. The company developed a search engine that helped users find information across the rapidly expanding web. Advertising turned that enormous flow of attention into revenue. And as the internet became central to everyday life, digital advertising became one of the most powerful businesses in the modern economy. Then came smartphones. The launch of Apple's iPhone in 2007 helped accelerate a transformation that put computing, cameras, communication, entertainment, navigation, shopping, and countless other services into a device people could carry in their pockets. Suddenly, the internet wasn't something people occasionally sat down to use. It was becoming part of everyday life. This created extraordinary wealth. But it also revealed something important about the American economic model. America's wealth wasn't simply the result of having more resources than everyone else. It increasingly came from creating systems that could multiply the value of those resources. A computer could process information. Software could be copied and distributed. A platform could connect millions of users. A financial market could move capital. A global brand could sell the same idea across dozens of countries. And a successful company could scale far beyond the deep limits of a traditional local business. This is one reason American companies have been able to become global giants. But there is another part of the story that is often overlooked: finance. Behind almost every major transformation in American history was capital. Building a railroad required enormous investment. Building a steel mill required capital. Drilling for oil required money. Constructing factories required financing. Developing new technologies required investors willing to accept the possibility of failure. America developed powerful financial institutions and capital markets that helped move money toward businesses and projects. With the potential to grow, Wall Street became one of the world's most important financial centers. Banks, investors, stock markets, venture capital firms, and later private equity markets all became part of the machinery that financed American growth. This system could create extraordinary success, but it could also create extraordinary risk. The same financial markets that helped fund innovation could also fuel speculation. The same access to capital that allowed companies to expand could encourage excessive borrowing. And the same interconnected economy that created enormous wealth could spread economic shocks rapidly. America experienced this again in 2008. The financial crisis exposed weaknesses in the housing and banking system. Major financial institutions faced enormous pressure. Credit markets froze. Businesses struggled. Millions of Americans lost jobs or homes. Once again, the country was reminded of a lesson it had learned in 1929. Economic power does not make an economy invincible, but America's ability to recover from major crises became another important part of its history. After the financial crisis, technology companies continued to expand. Smartphones became nearly universal in many American households. Cloud computing grew. Social media transformed communication. E-commerce became a normal part of everyday life, and a new generation of companies built enormous businesses around digital platforms. At the same time, American companies remained deeply connected to global supply chains. This created an unusual economic reality. A product could carry an American brand while depending on factories, suppliers, minerals, engineers, and workers spread across multiple countries. America had moved from an economy centered primarily on producing things domestically to one increasingly focused on designing, financing, managing, marketing, and innovating within a global system. That transformation created enormous wealth, but it also created serious questions. Who benefits from economic growth? What happens to workers whose industries disappear? What happens when technology makes certain jobs obsolete? How should wealth be distributed? And what happens when a small number of companies become powerful enough to influence entire industries? These questions matter because America's story is not simply a story of success. It is a story of constant transformation. Every generation inherited an economy built by the previous one and then changed it. Farmers created agricultural wealth. Railroads connected markets. Factories created mass production. Entrepreneurs built national companies. Consumers created enormous demand. Scientists and engineers created new technologies. Investors supplied capital. And millions of workers turned ideas into real economic output. There was never one single engine powering American prosperity. It was an entire ecosystem. And that ecosystem produced something remarkable: compound growth. A railroad did more than transport goods. It made new businesses possible. Those businesses created jobs. Those jobs created income. That income created consumer demand. Consumer demand encouraged more production. Production created profits. Profits financed new investment. And new investment created new technologies. The cycle continued. This is one of the deepest reasons America became rich. Not because one generation discovered a magic formula, but because economic advantages accumulated over time. Infrastructure created opportunity. Opportunity attracted people. People created businesses. Businesses created technology. Technology increased productivity. Productivity created more wealth. And wealth created more capital for future innovation. But by the 21st century, America faced a new challenge. The world had changed. China had become an enormous industrial power. Global competition had intensified. Automation was changing manufacturing. Artificial intelligence was beginning to transform knowledge work. Climate and energy concerns were reshaping investment. And inequality had become a major economic and political issue. America could no longer assume that the advantages of the past would automatically guarantee the future. The country would have to innovate again. And that brings us to the most important question of all. If America's wealth was built through repeated transformations, what made those transformations possible in the first place? The answer goes deeper than money. It goes deeper than natural resources. And it goes deeper than any single company or invention. Because America's greatest economic asset may have been its ability to repeatedly turn change into opportunity. That ability to turn change into opportunity may be the most important part of America's economic story. America became rich not because everything went according to plan, but because generation after generation found ways to build on what came before. The railroad transformed geography. The factory transformed production. Mass manufacturing transformed consumption. The automobile transformed mobility. Electricity transformed everyday life. Computing transformed information. The internet transformed communication. And the digital economy transformed the way businesses could reach the world. Each transformation created winners, losers, disruptions, and enormous uncertainty. But it also increased productivity, and productivity is at the heart of long-term economic wealth. If one worker can produce twice as much in the same amount of time because of better tools, technology, education, infrastructure, or organization, the economy has the potential to create more value. That principle appeared repeatedly throughout American history. Consider the factory worker. A century ago, producing a complicated machine could require enormous amounts of manual labor, standardized parts, assembly lines, electric machinery, computers, robotics, and software gradually changed that process. The result was not simply more products, it was lower production costs, greater output, and entirely new industries. The same pattern appeared in agriculture. American farmers adopted machinery, fertilizers, improved seeds, irrigation, and eventually sophisticated digital technologies. Fewer workers could produce vastly more food than previous generations. That freed millions of people to work in other parts of the economy. They moved into factories, then offices, then services, then technology. Economic development was, in many ways, a massive movement of human labor toward activities that could create greater value. But technology alone cannot explain America's rise. Institutions mattered too. Property rights, financial markets, universities, transportation systems, legal institutions, corporations, and government. Investment all played different roles in creating an environment where economic activity could expand. And perhaps most importantly, America developed a culture that often rewarded experimentation. Not every entrepreneur succeeded. Most new businesses did not become giants. Many inventions failed. Many investments lost money. Many companies disappeared. But the system allowed successful ideas to grow enormously. That distinction is critical. A country doesn't become wealthy because every idea works. It becomes wealthy when enough productive ideas succeed, and when successful ideas can scale. That is why companies like Ford, Standard Oil, General Electric, IBM, Microsoft, Apple, Amazon, Google, and countless others matter to the larger story. They were not simply individual businesses. They became examples of how an American company could take an idea, organize capital and labor around it, improve it, and eventually serve a massive market. But there is another side of this story that cannot be ignored. America's wealth was not created equally or fairly for everyone. Economic growth often came with enormous human costs. Industrial workers faced dangerous conditions. Child labor was once widespread. Workers fought long battles for better wages and safer workplaces. Millions of people were excluded from economic opportunities because of discrimination and unequal laws. Native American communities suffered enormous losses as the country expanded westward. Enslaved people were violently denied freedom and compensation for their labor, while the institution of slavery became deeply connected to the American economy before the Civil War. So the story of American wealth is not simply a celebration. It is also a story of conflict, exploitation, inequality, reform, and change. Understanding that complexity makes the story more not less, important. Because wealth is not just about how much a country produces. It is also about who has access to opportunity, who benefits from growth, and what happens to the people left behind. And that debate continues today. America remains one of the world's most powerful economic centers. Its financial markets remain enormous. Its universities and research institutions continue to produce new ideas. Its technology companies operate on a global scale. Its entertainment, software, aerospace, pharmaceutical, financial, and consumer industries influence markets around the world. But America's future prosperity is not guaranteed. The same forces that created its wealth can also create new problems. Automation can increase productivity while eliminating certain jobs. Globalization can lower prices while weakening some domestic industries. Technology can create billion-dollar companies while leaving some communities behind. Financial innovation can unlock investment while creating new forms of risk. And artificial intelligence may become another enormous economic transformation whose full consequences are still unknown. So what can we actually learn from America's journey? Perhaps the biggest lesson is that wealth is not a pile of money sitting somewhere. It is a system. It is roads, ports, factories, universities, banks, software, machines, businesses, workers, ideas, institutions, and knowledge working together. And above all, it is productivity. America repeatedly became richer by finding ways to produce more value with the resources it had. Sometimes that came from technology, sometimes from infrastructure, sometimes from entrepreneurship, sometimes from immigration, sometimes from government investment, sometimes from competition, and often from several of these forces working together. That is why there was never one moment when America suddenly became rich. There was no single invention, no single president, no single businessman, no single industry. Instead, America's wealth was built layer by layer. A young agricultural republic became an industrial nation. An industrial nation became a mass consumer economy. A manufacturing powerhouse became a technological superpower, and a technological superpower became the center of a global digital economy. That transformation took more than 2 centuries. It involved extraordinary successes and extraordinary failures. It created fortunes and destroyed fortunes. It opened doors for millions and left others behind. But through every transformation, one thing remained constant: change. America's economic history is ultimately the story of what happens when a country repeatedly adapts to change and builds institutions, businesses, technologies, and markets capable of turning that change into new forms of value. From the first canals to the railroads, from steel mills to assembly lines, from Wall Street to Silicon Valley, from the factory floor to the smartphone in your hand, the American economy was never finished. It kept reinventing itself. And perhaps that is the real untold story of how America became rich. It wasn't simply that America had enormous land, abundant resources, or a growing population. It was that Americans repeatedly found new ways to connect those resources with human ambition, capital, technology, and markets. The country didn't become wealthy overnight. It accumulated advantages. One generation built infrastructure, the next expanded industry, another transformed technology, another created global companies, and each generation inherited a larger economic machine than the one before. That is how wealth compounds across history, not just through money, but through knowledge, through infrastructure, through institutions, through technology, and through ideas that survive long after the people who created them are gone. So when you look at America today, the skyscrapers, financial centers, highways, factories, universities, technology companies, and global brands are not the beginning of the story. They are the result of it. A story that began with a young nation trying to survive and continued through centuries of invention, ambition, crisis, competition, and reinvention. And the most fascinating part is this: the story of how America became rich may not actually be finished. The next transformation, from artificial intelligence to advanced manufacturing, from new energy technologies to industries that don't yet exist, could reshape American prosperity once again. Just as railroads once changed the 19th century and computers changed the 20th, the technologies of the 21st century may determine what comes next. Because America's greatest economic advantage was never simply what it had. It was its ability to keep changing what it could do. If you enjoyed this journey through the hidden history of American wealth, like the video and subscribe for more documentaries exploring the untold stories behind America's greatest companies, industries, technologies, and economic transformations. Because sometimes the best way to understand the wealth of today is to discover the forgotten decisions that built it.